Hi and welcome to the practical part of the lecture where I'm going to be running through some teaching strategies for promoting students' progression in use of evidence. So I'm going to split this up into four sections really, talk about how you might select the kind of evidence you use, how you'd encourage the children to understand, to basically comprehend the sources, how you move into analysis, and then to the higher level of interpretation. So start off with some warnings really. With the best of intentions, people who are writing about how history education has been developing have pointed out there are some problems that have emerged. The first is that source work becomes obsessed with gobbets of information, and I'll say something about this in the next slide. The second is that pupils were increasingly trained. We're talking about the 80s and 90s in England when there was a development of a schools history project and a real push to do more creative work with evidence. But that led to the drawback that children were trained in these automatic responses to spot bias, to spot primary or secondary sources and to list those kinds of attributes about them. That also encouraged teachers to decontextualize the study of sources so that you were just being trained to talk about a source out of context. And then not relate that to the historical context either in which you were studying. And then finally that meant sources weren't interpreted within an overarching investigation. So there was no clear purpose to the source work. And as McAlevey, quoted in Phillips, said in judgment of that, the last 20 years, so the 80s and 90s in England, have shown that to be constantly told to spot bias and comment on the reliability of primary and secondary sources can be just as boring as being told to memorise a collection of facts and dates. So in response to an old version of history, we'd come along with a new version based on sources, but actually we'd stripped that of interest as well and made that boring and repetitive. So there's a challenge to come up with the best of both worlds really, and to come up with something which is genuinely interesting and engaging for children. And what McAlevey was saying was that by the end of the 90s we hadn't really quite achieved it in schools. So this is what was meant by the criticism that we've arrived at a place of gobbets of information. I mean, in reality, sources in historical enquiries are many and varied, and there are all sorts of different types of evidence, but this is absolutely typical of lots of textbooks, which is that you have a short text written by the textbook author, which asserts this kind of authoritative single story, and then you have very short pre-digested bits of information that are presented as sources. So we have the cartoon, and then we have the two quotes over on the right hand side, and we have a line or two about the provenance of each source. And this is something that's come in for some criticism that says, well, children get lots of sources to deal with now in lots of textbooks, but they're all like this. They're all short, they're all pre-digested, they're often written in child-friendly language, and we're not really told enough about the context in which these sources were generated to be able to do much about it. So it all becomes simplified. So it's an invitation for us to return back to some of the richness of source work when we're thinking about what to introduce in our classroom. So yes, we've got the textbook and we've got those kind of pre-digested bits of information that have been presented for secondary school students, but we've also got letters and diaries and genuine artifacts. We've got objects from museums, or at least in the internet age, pictures and images, representations of those objects. We've got artwork, we've got potential visits to galleries and museums, we've got photographs, we've got films covering the last 100 years of modern history, and we've got different ways of presenting numerical data. And Sam Weinberg, in reflecting on conversations he had with university students about how they engage with sources of information, said it may be actually easier for students to construe pictorial rather than textual sources within a supplied or an inferred context, because they focus on what is it as a question rather than what does it say. What he's getting at here is that right the way through up to university, if you give a student a written source in a textbook, then they will read it as text, and the way that we normally read text is to wonder to ourselves, what does it tell us, what does it say? But if you give me a vase or a picture, I have to say, what is it? What kind of an object is it first and foremost? So I engage with it more obviously as a source of evidence rather than a source of information. And Weinberg says that this runs right the way through, as I say, up to university. So it's going to be characteristics of many children in school as well. So the first thing to say about selecting sources is don't, just because you're encouraged to use textbooks and they're easy to use in the classroom, let's not completely narrow the range of evidence we use over a term's worth of work. Let's always remember to broaden it out on occasion, because we can do different things with different source work and we can use them in different ways. So once we've chosen sources, and I'm going to focus on the written source now in terms of comprehension, we need to make sure that we don't just assume, because we've given someone written text, that it's easy to access and understand it, and we need to make sure we give students time to work through evidence so they can achieve their own level of understanding, especially if that evidence is substantial and not a pre-digested, rewritten gobbet of information. So here's an example of text that I've deliberately rendered almost incomprehensible to make a point about the way that lots of comprehension activities are conducted in class. So here's the text and here are my questions. I'm just going to give you a moment to have a look at this. If you want to hit pause and see how many of the questions you can answer even without understanding it, then that would be a good idea. And then assuming you've either pressed pause and come back or you're not going to, I'll just run through one or two examples. So the first question is, what three words does Carlyle think do not describe the flummox? And if I go to the text, and the top left hand side, it says, if we were required to describe the flummox of ours by any single word, we would not be tempted to call it Endymion, Basanic or Crestilian. So the answer to question one is, what three words does Carlyle think do not describe the flummox? Carlyle thinks the three words Endymion, Basanic and Crestilian do not describe the flummox. Question two, what flummox does Carlyle think we're living in? Well, the next sentence says, we would call it the Dumantic flummox. So my answer to question two is the Dumantic flummox. And when my teacher comes along and marks this assignment, I get 5 out of 5 because I can work out the right answers. But I don't understand any of it, because as I've said, this is gobbledygook, and all I'm doing is really just reproducing words in the right order because I understand how grammar in a sentence works. So here's the actual text. And here are the real questions. What three words does Carlyle think do not describe the age? Answer, heroic, devotional or moral. And I'm going to suggest that although those are English words, that many children age 11 or 12 could tell you the answer is heroic, devotional or moral, but wouldn't really understand what Carlyle meant by that. So they're able to reprocess information on a page to pass a straightforward comprehension test, but there is no comprehension necessarily being secured through this kind of activity. So what kinds of things can we do to secure genuine comprehension? Well, there's a tradition in education called DARTS, which just is an acronym for Directed Activities Related to Text, and it's a very useful set of strategies to unpick especially extended or particularly complicated text, and especially with younger children who might not have the highest level literacy skills. So there's a website address at the bottom of the page here that it's well worth visiting. So I haven't reproduced all of the bits of advice they give you in that booklet, and I'd advise you to take a look at that. Some very good practical strategies for any classroom. But I am just going to share one strategy which seems to me particularly useful for the history teacher who wants to engage with a longer piece of work. Let's say you've got a letter which is particularly important, or even that you've got a page from a book written by a historian. So this is ideally designed for something which is an extended text with several paragraphs. So what you need for the activity is to take the text, photocopy it onto a large page with broad borders, so there's lots of room for the children to write around the text, and also separate the paragraphs so there is some space between the paragraphs for the children to write in. You need some dictionaries and highlighter pens, and this is a way to spend almost a whole lesson just working on one source. So you basically give the method to the children and you let them work through the source in their own time, and generally in twos or threes, so they can have a discussion about any things which are problematic. The first stage is to identify any difficult words and to look them up, because you haven't translated this into child-friendly language. There may well be some specialist historical language that they need to check in a dictionary. The second thing is then to highlight the most important ideas in each paragraph. And obviously that's why it helps to be working in pairs, because the students can have a discussion about what is really important and why they think it's important. Once you've identified that, the children can then give each paragraph a subheading, something which captures the essence of what's going on in that paragraph. And then when they've done those things, they should be able to summarize the source itself. And if you offer some kind of incentive or just encourage children to come up with the shortest but most accurate summary they can devise, and then it can be quite fun for the children to compare who's got the best summary and judge who's come up with the best summary. It's a really useful way just to get the children to read very closely, to think quite intensively about the meanings encoded in an extended source, and then to share their interpretations of it to make sure that they're extracting the right kind of information from that difficult source. Other things you might do at this stage to secure comprehension: split the class into small groups and hand out the same text to each, and then each group reads the text, decides on the main themes and write down their own 3 questions, and then they ask those questions to other children. So children demonstrate their comprehension to you as the teacher by being able to respond to each other's questions. And 3 of a kind is that you hand out a complex document and ask pupils in small groups to summarise each key point in 3 words. And then you might practice that with conventions, declarations or charters or laws, where the points are listed but are often expressed in a fairly wordy manner. And again, you can share answers to determine the best answer. And here's a related idea, which is more about pre-teaching before you get to the reading stage. Here you might outline the historical context that led to that document being produced. Let's say 1945, and you're looking at the Declaration of Human Rights. You might set the scene for the children, ask them to write their own charter, and then compare it to the actual document. And then because they're making a comparison, they're noting what seems significant to them, they're more likely to be able to express comprehension of what's important in there. So once you've got them to a level of comprehending the task, you need to move into analysis. And here's the most useful strategy that all teachers have at their fingertips, the 5W questions, to be able to ask this of any written source: who produced it, what is it, what kind of document is it, when was it produced, where was it produced, and why was it produced, what purpose did it have. But we can embed those kinds of questions into other more active learning strategies. So here's an example: display a key quote on a large piece of paper and ask pupils to come up and add a note or highlight any area of the text they think is important, and then invite them to explain their graffiti. So they're identifying what they think is important and then articulating their explanations to others. Pupils take it in turn to read and comment on or interpret a sentence in the text. So pupil A reads a sentence, and then instead of pupil B reading the next sentence, pupil B interprets the first sentence or just says something about why it's important. And then you move on and read the next sentence and ask another student to respond. Next activity is to split the class into groups and give each group a separate question. Then you read the text out aloud to the class and ask each group to discuss their question. So that means every group are listening to the same source but with a different purpose, listening for different information, extracting a different significance. Then you mix up the groups so that each new group includes someone from each of the previous question groups, and then they can discuss the nature and significance of the text in a more broader way. Or you can have a post-it wall where the class reads the text, and then one by one pupils come up to the wall to place their post-it notes with a relevant word on each to reflect the nature of the text and the pupil's response. Each new contribution is not allowed to repeat a word that's already been placed. And then this is an important additional layer. The students have to cluster their post-its so that all the ones with related ideas are joined together. And then you discuss this and the way in which they're being clustered as you go along. And that's a very easy way to graphically organise the children's ideas and to demonstrate that they're a conceptual link. So you're creating a kind of thematic analysis of the source as you go through by grouping thematically their comments. And then another activity to think about is just very straightforward, is the power of comparison. So you give students carefully chosen sources to compare so that the comparison sets them up to draw out significant themes. So you could pick an argument for or against the same thing, a perspective from different places on the same issue, and asking children to compare and contrast is often an easier way to get them to abstract and conceptual thinking than asking questions about a single source. This was driven home by a colleague who was watching a student teacher lesson on trying to decode the symbolism in the covers of books, and asking a 14-year-old to comment on the symbolism on the cover of a book is very difficult. But by asking the 14-year-old to compare the covers in two editions of the same book, they were then able to comment on why the artist in one had chosen a different colour, or why, whether one image felt more friendly or more child-friendly or more accessible than another one. So they were actually able to comment on the symbolism of the book cover, but they did it through comparing two concrete examples rather than just applying an abstract framework. And so this strikes me as a very useful tool to remember when asking children to look at source work in the classroom. And then once you've achieved some level of comprehension and begun to get them to unpick what's going on in that source, to analyse it, then you need to move on to fuller interpretations. So the Caption challenge is one way to do that. Hand out a variety of text to small groups in the class. Ask each group to come up with a caption or a title for the text. And then for each text they should devise a caption that reflects their interpretation and another that reflects the author's interpretation. And then display and discuss these and think about the issues they highlight or how they could be improved. And obviously the really useful thing here is to help the students to move on from just treating sources as information and start to see it as evidence. So you start to understand that the person who wrote this may have had a very different intention and a very different purpose and interpreted it in a very different way to how we are doing so now. Another very useful strategy is to start with the source and then layer the inferences that you can draw from the source. So we do this physically on a large sheet of paper. So the first layer is just, what does the source tell me? The second is, what can I infer from that source? And then lastly we come to, what questions do I have now that I've thought about this source? What's left for me to find out? So here's an example of how that might work in practice. Here's a picture of children being taken out of a city in the UK during the Second World War during evacuation, when children were moved out of cities during a bombing raid or a series of bombing raids from the Nazi Air Force, and taken out to live in the countryside where it was felt they would be safer. So what does it tell me? Well, it tells me that children left cities during World War II for evacuation in large groups, smiling and by train. What can I infer? Well, I can infer that the fear of bombing in cities had become significant enough for there to be developed an organised system for evacuating large numbers. And then I can infer, presumably, that the government organised this because it happened on a large scale, it happened via public transport. I can also start to think that the children's smiling faces may indicate that they're not scared about what's happening to them. Perhaps they're happy to leave the dangerous city. So what questions do I have, having thought about these first two layers of meaning? Well, first, I need to ask myself, what was it really like for children? Are those smiles genuine, or are they putting on a brave face? Where did they all go? How many train loads left the cities? How long were they away from home? How did people feel about receiving other people's children in their houses? What if their parents died while they were away? Could people stay with their brothers and sisters? Could they stay with their friends? So, starting with this source, I can answer some questions, but it generates lots more for me to think about, lots more questions that will help me move on in my history investigation. Some of these I might decide I don't need to answer because they're not so important for my project, but others might be useful in helping me go away and find other sources of information that give me some answers to these questions. And in this way, I'm using the sources intelligently to move me along in my history investigation. So another activity to do to move on into this interpretation phase is hot seating. So we might read a text as a class and then decide who are the most interesting and important characters in that text. Invite a pupil who's confident to take the hot seat and take questions from the class related to their role and the source, and then invite the audience to comment and discuss their answers. We can also invite others to take the hot seat if they want to offer an alternative point of view. And we need to remember here that we're not excavating historical facts through this kind of activity, but we are exercising possible lines of inquiry that might stimulate us to go away and find other evidence or develop new hypotheses to test out. So some of these activities are drawn from my own experience, some are taken from these few references. So far then we've looked at some of the theory and research underpinning this area of history learning, and I've bombarded you slightly with a list of possible teaching activities we can use to try and encourage children up into the higher levels of understanding in terms of how they deal with evidence. And in the final short lecture I'll have a look at the 2 readings that you've been given and draw out some key principles from that, and then set the scene for your task for the week.